Thank you, Village President, Village Board. Tonight, we have one item to present, and we figured we could do that during the Administrator's Report. This is regarding the Public Safety Options Assessment that we prepared earlier this year with Miller Communications. And so I'm going to invite Chief Repke and Chief Smentana to come up. As you're aware, over the past several years, the Village Board and staff have evaluated public safety staffing needs. In 2018, the Fire Chief presented an internal assessment of the department and the need for additional staffing, and this prompted the Village to hire McGrath Consulting in 2009 to conduct a third-party review for the Fire and Rescue Department, which called for an addition of 12 fire medics to our current staffing level. At the same time, the police department also brought forward their needs of an additional 4 officers. In 2020, staff took a deeper dive and reviewed our staffing and response policies to determine how best to meet the McGrath recommendations and other public safety needs. In the spring, the Village Board hired Miller Communications, a Milwaukee-based public affairs and communication firm experienced in working with municipalities on public education and community engagement. The firm has helped the village staff communicate the current challenge and develop potential solutions, which we'll present to you tonight. In a nutshell, the current public safety funding is insufficient to meet the growing service demands and the needs of the community. And to better understand that, we've prepared this options assessment. Chief Repke will review or kind of go over the fire department needs, and then afterwards, Dave Smentana will review the needs from the policing. And then I'll follow up and just discuss kind of the options that are available to us and kind of the next steps. So with that, Chief Repke.
Nathan, thank you. Mr. President, members of the board, good evening. So in the slide that you currently see in the needs and options assessment that was created by Miller Communications based on data provided by the village administrator, police, and fire departments. Just kind of as an overview, as we start off to essentially what does the fire department do and what are they responsible for? So I won't read this slide for slide, but essentially, the fire department provides fire suppression, EMS, and what we refer to as specialized rescue services. And we also, in addition to that, we provide the statutory mandated fire inspections for all commercial and public buildings, public education, training, vehicle maintenance, facility maintenance, and we do have some other programs such as smoke alarm installations, through the state. Slide. So this slide goes into over the last several years in regards to staffing. We currently talk about what we currently have. We have 27 full-time fire medics with 1 chief, 2 assistant chiefs, and 1 full-time administrative person. And so we talk about the historical staffings through the past years and how in 2020 we started bumping that up. Slide. This slide speaks to in regards to our total area. We have approximately 34 square miles. We're a large jurisdiction, and that essentially has spread over. Our staffing is spread over a large geographical area, and this slide is attempting to just make a comparison to other communities as far as what their staffing over their jurisdictional size is. Slide. I'm sure everyone knows where our Station 1 and Station 2 is currently. Springbrook Road here just up the street, and Highway H and Highway C for our Station number 2. We talk a little bit about the makeup of Station 1, makeup of Station 2. Station 2 historically originally housed the police department, and also at one point in time housed the police department and the fire department. And so it's gone through several different renovations over its life, and now we're pretty much maxed out as far as from a real estate perspective of trying to house administrative and the growing needs for staff. Slide. We talk a little bit about here in this slide just over time the number of incidents and the increase in incidents over time since 2009 and talking up until 2019. You will notice that in 2020 we did take a dip or a reduction in calls for service incidents. We can clearly equate that to COVID, as I'm sure Chief Smetana can, and many other jurisdictions have as well. A lot of our calls, nearly 40% of them, are what we refer to as overlapping, so that while the first call is going on, the second call starts, which in many cases leaves us without any resources left. That's all I have for the fire side. I'll entertain any questions should you have them.
I think Craig will wait for questions to the end.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of the board. I am here to present some information from the law enforcement side of public safety for the village. As you can see by the slide, these are just a few of the capabilities and skills and resources that the police department delivers to its community. In addition to the items you see listed, it's a long list, but it's not exhaustive. We've got personnel trained in tactical response who serve with a multi-jurisdictional tactical response team. We've got officers who are trained with a crowd control multi-jurisdictional team. We have a school resource officer who takes over and deals with the 4 unified schools within our district and services our young students and our teachers assisting KUSD. We also have an officer assigned to the Crisis Negotiations Unit. I mention those because all those skills translate back to teach the other officers those skills and to bring them up to speed on that, and those are valuable resources. Pleasant Prairie PD is also the only Kenosha County law enforcement agency that's fully accredited through the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Accreditation Group. Pleasant Prairie PD services 250 residents in a vast area of 33.64 square miles, which is a very large jurisdiction for its size. Next slide, please. Under the staffing levels, the staffing levels have remained relatively consistent over the last 11 years. You see we made some jumps, some incremental jumps in 13, 14, 15, 16, and then up to our present allotment of officers of 36. And since the inception of Pleasant Prairie PD 50 years ago, the PPD, or the police department, along with the village leadership, has taken steps to grow our agency systematically and responsibly along those lines. Our staffing levels to date have remained consistent at this point. We have 36 sworn officers. Those 36 officers make up the entirety of the agency, from patrol officers to investigators and detectives to administrative personnel. Our agency is responsible, as I mentioned, for police services across 33 square miles. Next slide, please. In that time, we have seen, is there a next slide? There you go. In between that time, we have also seen a 7.5% increase in calls for service. While that is strictly the calls for services coming in, it doesn't account for almost the 8,600 calls each year that are officer initiated, that the officers open up themselves, such as traffic stops, such as suspicious calls, such as the OOPS cards we fill out to help the public gain awareness of of crime prevention tactics. And with additional officers, what that allows us to do is to increase those capabilities. So it increases the capabilities of not only responding to those calls for service in a more expeditious manner, but also doing those self-initiated calls and being freed up to those self-initiated calls. So if we're on calls for service on a regular basis, that's less time we are in our neighborhoods, and that's a priority. That's been a priority for this agency for 50 years, is that community contact, and we don't want to see that slip at this point. Next slide, please.
I think, Chief, that's the conclusion, unless you have anything else to add.
All I want to mention is the complexity of the cases has grown as well. You know, I've got the benefit of almost 4 decades in law enforcement. Over the past 10 years, I think I've seen the greatest difference in the types of cases we are handling, and the length that those cases take to bring from the initial starting point to the end. You know, 10, 15 years ago, we didn't have Ring doorbells. We didn't have all the video surveillance. We didn't have all the cameras and cell phones that we had to go through and document for all these crimes. All those really great resources help us solve crimes, but they also take a great deal of time. So I appreciate your patience in gathering up this information. And turned over to Village Administrator Nathan Thiel. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. So as both chiefs have well illustrated, the growth and demand for public safety services, that's reflective of the village's growth over the past decade. The chart that you see before you basically demonstrates the estimated growth that the state has presented. We recently received our 2020 census numbers, which has placed our population at 21,250, or approximately 7.8% growth in just 1 decade. When we consider the growth in value over the past decade, the improved value of businesses in the village has increased 149%. We've seen during the decade continued growth or experienced growth in commercial and industrial growth at Lakeview Corporate Park, Prairie Wood Corporate Park, and Prairie Ridge Commercial Development Area, and other commercial and industrial areas in the village. All in all, that has also brought in, raised significant property tax. In 2010, commercial development brought in about $3.4 million, and then in 2020, 9.8 million. But all of that has gone to basically, we've seen gradual growth in services. The second station, we've seen some gradual growth with police officers, but it's outpaced our ability to provide necessary public services. When we look at property tax and how it funds public safety, there's a mix of revenue from property tax levy, fees and tickets, and grants. But 86% of that, their budget is basically paid through property tax and shared revenue. And as you are aware, shared revenue has been falling. Property taxes has been capped, and so our ability to fund these services through the large portion of the pie is significantly limited. When we look at identifying the community needs, because of the growth in commercial and industrial and because of the growth in population, we basically, and the growth in 62% increase in calls for service from fire and rescue, and the 7.5 increase in community calls to the police department, in addition to an increase in calls and types of cases the police department is encountering are more complex. The fundamental challenge facing the Village of Pleasant Prairie is to seek to maintain its successful and accredited public safety programs, is that staffing levels have not kept pace with the growing demands for service. driven by this growth in population and increase in development. Department leaders, village staff, and external experts, including the McGrath Consulting Group, have assessed the needs of the Pleasant Prairie and concluded that the following measures are necessary in order to bring public safety capabilities up to an appropriate level as compared to the demands and size, makeup, and population of the community, including the hiring of 12 additional fire medics, the addition of a third fire station, and the hiring of 4 additional police officers. Bolstering the public safety departments in this way would require an addition of $1.6 million to the village's safety budget to fund each additional staff member. I would note that the third fire station, our ability to fund that, we have flexibility within our budget or within the tools that the state has allotted for us to be able to take care of that additional station. However, even if we were to build a station today, the question is how will we staff it? And that's really the limiting factor here. So there are a couple of options available to us to be precise. The first is simply to maintain status quo. And doing nothing and maintaining our status quo, while sounds fine and easy, over time, if the village does not identify funding for additional fire and police personnel, existing challenge will only create more strain on the departments. Maintaining the status quo would likely compound the current stressors on the Pleasant Prairie's public safety services in the years to come as population and development trends continue, and maintaining the status quo would also likely increase response times. If the village does not identify new funding sources and must keep staffing levels the same as they are today, that will impact the quality of public safety services provided and also impact other services because as the strain or pressure increases on public safety, we'll want to address those needs, and so we'll place holds on other things that may be of a lesser priority, like parks or street maintenance, but are still just as vital to maintain the quality of service, their quality of life that we have in Pleasant Prairie. The second option is to try to find resources to cut budgets and to do service reductions. The village of Pleasant Prairie operates with a lean and efficient budget as is and has made past adjustments to enable public safety services to continue effectively. If you'll recall, before we had shown that pie of 86%, right, of property taxes going to public services. If we were to look at all the other services that the village provides, unlike public safety, a large percentage, upwards to 60%, of the funding comes from charges for services, comes from other resources. So it's not just a simple cut services or other public services in order to bolster public safety. There's some limiting factors there because as you cut those services, you're also cutting revenues that you're receiving to perform those services. Examples of services that we could cut are services that we don't receive charges for services or where we don't receive alternative revenues, things like snow plowing, right, or cutting grass in the parks. There's things like discontinuing local emergency dispatch services instead paying for a shared service rather than operating our own. And then there's also the idea of cutting back on street improvements or resurfacing of roads and so forth. Again, all of those have other impacts, and as staff have reviewed, the ability to reduce services sufficiently to make up the 1.6 is just so tight, it would be very difficult to be able to find those resources. These cuts would likely strain the community by reducing quality of services the village can provide in other areas other than public safety. So the third potential is to identify additional sources of revenue. And there are three options available to the village. We could go to referendum, basically ask the taxpayers for additional money to support additional public safety. Another option is the wheel tax. And then finally, the ability to create a utility charge for streets, and therefore basically take the property tax that we currently allocate towards streets. We would take that property tax and shift it to public safety. I have two slides with regard to the referendum and to the wheel tax. The utility charge would take a bit of effort or staff time to think about and how to incorporate. There's a bit of policy issues tied to that, but at the end of the day, it's still an additional charge that property owners would need to pay. When we look at property tax or the referendum, the state of Wisconsin limits the amount of property tax a municipality can collect each year. In order to exceed the levy limit, the municipality needs voters to approve a village-wide referendum. That could be completed through a referendum during the spring of 2022, a general election, which, if approved, would provide additional funding starting in 2023. To increase public safety services to an appropriate level for the village of Pleasant Prairie, the village must hire 4 additional officers. 16 additional officers, which would equate to about 1.6 million annual, or 1.6 million. Based on the 2021 reval, village mill rate in 2023 will decrease to about $4.23 compared to our $4.64. It would basically, we also are anticipating the median home value to be about $296,500. This would basically equate to us asking $124 more in property tax, about $10 per month, to ensure adequate public safety services. With regard to the wheel tax, the Wisconsin allows municipalities to collect an annual municipal vehicle registration fee, or a wheel tax. The fee basically applies to vehicles kept in the municipality or registered in the municipality or county. These fees, note that these fees would be in addition to the state's already $85 annual fee. And also, whatever our fee we set, basically there would be a 17 cents per vehicle application chargeback to the municipality. There are about 16,500 eligible vehicles within Pleasant Prairie, and so if we were to just do the math, in order to make up that 1.6 million, we'd basically be charging about $97 per vehicle. Generally speaking, in other communities that have a wheel tax or charge a registration fee, they're averaging about $20 per vehicle in general across the state. The last option is a little bit more nuanced and has been discussed, I think, in the past when it's come to the police department, but partnering with some surrounding communities. In general, we do partner with surrounding communities, but the idea that several municipalities in southeastern Wisconsin have consolidated public safety services in what is known as shared services or mutual aid model. The village of Pleasant Prairie collaborates with neighboring agencies, leveraging this model of shared services to ensure that residents and businesses in Pleasant Prairie have timely and quality access to public safety services is the true concern. In Pleasant Prairie, the reality is that shared services are not just necessary in specialized areas. current challenges necessitate the Pleasant Prairie Police Department, Pleasant Prairie Fire and Rescue requests to ask assistance from neighboring departments in response to routine calls for services. Those neighboring departments, many of whom are also experiencing staffing challenges, are not always available to step in and fill the gaps created by understaffed village public safety departments. So there's only so much that we can depend on other agencies to support or assist. And the idea of completely consolidating with another agency basically takes away control from the village to kind of define its own destiny. While the village can and will continue to explore deeper collaboration with other municipalities, there's not currently a viable collaboration model that would meet the full public safety staffing requirements for the village's current and future needs. So with that, this concludes the public safety assessment, our options assessment. And moving forward, the intent is to take these options and this assessment to the public, garner feedback and thought processes from the community. The intent is to conduct a survey in the future to gauge public opinion as far as what options are preferred, and to continue to do public education, and then we'll bring back those results to the village board later this year. But right now, any questions from the village board regarding the presentation?
Any questions? Mike? If I could go back to on the fire slide, particularly staffing level remaining flat, which it has, but I think for the one thing that doesn't show up, like I think that gives it some context and shows the struggle that the department is dealing with, is the fact that if you go back to 2012, and if you were to track the declining number of paid on call staff and our ability to use an alternate model, it really isn't functioning anymore, either in Pleasant Prairie or any other community, where you have that balance of having the needs of a highly trained paramedic and firefighting department versus what would be probably a rural department where that's not the need. We don't have the same ability, and the personnel aren't available to do that kind of work anymore. So I think this assumes that we've been able to kind of go along as we could with just the existing full-time staff. And the truth be known, we haven't been able to do that at all, and it did require paid on-call people who that resource is really not available to us anymore, because or part-time people, because they're not available. That type of employee isn't available, and I think it would seem to add some more significance to what the needs of the department are.
Mike, that's an excellent point, that if we were to add the paid on call or the part-time firefighters, it would exaggerate this chart in the sense that you'd see a decline rather than just staying flat. One other comment, if you went to the next slide, I realize that this is, typically we look at just population as kind of a measure of how many personnel we have to cover. But this was one point that I didn't spend a lot of time, or we didn't spend a ton of time talking about, but just to recognize that when you look at South Milwaukee, for instance, their square mileage is much smaller, right? They've got a similar population, but their square mileage is a lot smaller. When you look at places like Mount Pleasant, they have a much similar comparison from both population and also from square mileage. And I think that it's important to also recognize that the ability to respond appropriately and in an adequate time, you need the personnel and also the stations, in close proximity in order to reduce those call times and those call volumes. And I think it's important to note that Pleasant Prairie is kind of on the bottom rung there. If we were to apply population, we'd also be on the bottom rung. And that's both on policing and also on fire. While we don't necessarily want to, I don't think we even need to exaggerate, the story or the argument. Statistics can always be argued. I think that just in general, the story that we show or demonstrate, there is a real need. And it's fairly easy to see. And when we dig into it, oftentimes it gets even more exaggerated, if you will, Mike. Like not intentionally, not misleading. It's just it becomes even more pronounced. So,
my second question on that subject, and I'm looking to see where it was the change in response time. Again, this is fire and rescue, where we were at 4 minutes and change in 2012, and now we're at, I believe it was at 6 minutes, if I got that right.
So one of the things that we're finding is the fact that because of our large jurisdiction, where you have to have Station 2 now respond to 124th Street and 3400 block, they literally have to come across town to make that response. And we're seeing more of that. And unfortunately, it's coming in a situation to where one is going all the way over to River Oaks, or Station 2 is coming all the way to 1817 as an example. Right. So now we're starting to see, because of the frequency of calls, we're literally seeing squads go across the village.
So and I can't remember if this was in the McGrath study, did the findings for Station 3, did that get us back down to that 4-minute response time, or the ability to shorten those up to that?
I off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you specifically. My guess would be is the fact that Station 3, and if we track what we would refer to as the Station 3 district to kind of find out what are those calls might look like. The other big plus for Station 3 is it starts to take over, where Station 2 is out, Station 3 can take on that call, and you don't have to bring a Station 1 unit all the way across town.
Right.
So that's how it kind of, it inserts itself into the system and helps the overall system.
I think if people realize, with the bulk of the calls being rescue, and the importance of the 4-minute response time for a medical call, is, when we first started this, that was critical for having a paramedic. You can't get there in a meaningful amount of time.
And you can only drive so fast.
Right.
And just to speak to what Chief Smetana mentioned about complexity, is with our paramedic system and our medical director giving us latitude on skill sets, our skills have now become more complex, where we now have the ability to what we refer to as rapid sequence intubation, where we literally paralyze the patient, and then we have to be able to insert that tube correctly and breathe for them because they're essentially paralyzed. Surgical airways, where we would actually do a cut down to the airway and perform, again, as mentioned, a surgical airway. We never were able to do that in the past. So our skill sets are becoming more advanced, more complex.
Okay, thanks. And then the last question I had for the administrator is on in our alternatives under the property tax option. Would it not be true, really, in 2023, given the way the levy limits work, in all actuality, property taxes go down only because there's growth in the tax, and it really doesn't have anything to do with our need for service. And so you'd have this situation where property taxes are going down and our ability to deliver service is going to go down just as well. I mean, there's that, I don't know how you explain that imbalance, but that's really where we're coming, is that over the last few years, you know, as the village has grown and taxes have either stabilized or drifted down, so have services, you know, to the extent that the village has found, you know, one way or another to kind of cover up the gap. That cover up is, I don't know what cover up, that ability to
Close the gap.
close the gap. You know, we're now at the point that it's not possible.
Yeah.
Am I wrong, or am I reading that wrong?
No, I think you're explaining that well. If I could just add kind of a little bit of color to it. When you think of it right now, our net new construction is where we're able to see increase in property tax revenue, right? But oftentimes that increase in net new construction doesn't even keep up with inflation. And so when you're thinking of the services that we're currently providing, our ability to continue to provide those services, if we're not keeping up with inflation and those are growing, it's putting more and more pressure on our ability to continue to fund those levels. And so it requires us to be more efficient. It requires us to, you know, do other service reductions or cut costs elsewhere. You know, maybe we're investing in new technology, and that technology makes it so that we don't need to fund the staff or whatever the case may be. But yes, over the past decade, it's made it very difficult for us to grow with the village because we can't even keep up with inflation. And the best demonstration of that is how flat our service levels have been for personnel. You know, if we could have kept up with police and fire, we would have, right? But obvious from just what we've shown today, that's been very difficult. And so, you know, I think in years that we've been able to add a police officer, we haven't been able to add a firefighter, right? And when we're trying to add 12 firefighters, you know, that can't just happen. And even to think that to try to build 12 firefighters, or sorry, fire and EMTs over the course of how many years, by the time we get there, even if we were to try to do it over the next decade, you know, by the time we get there, we're going to be behind the 8 ball even more with our growth.
The other thing that I think you did a good job describing the option of sharing services, but I think that the general public doesn't realize how much that goes on a day in, day out basis, especially in fire, rescue. There's a whole institution for MABUS that's set up to do that, and it works pretty well, but it's always been premised on the concept that you're able to at least take care of your business for yourself, that you're not relying on another community to come in and to do what you should have to do just on a normal basis.
Right. I didn't say what the slide says. I think that would probably be beneficial. Chief Craig, do you mind coming up and just talking a little bit about this idea? I know on the slide it says 120 times, 57 times. Can you explain?
Yeah. So as you well know, we do mutual aid today, and we have different, and I will refer to as different flavors of mutual aid. We have an entity called MABUS, or Mutual Aid Box Alarm System, which is really geared towards larger incidents requiring a lot more resources and personnel, and those are all pre-planned. So that would happen on like an old water fire years and years ago. Okay. The other type of mutual aid we do is I'll say like the singular. So we need another ambulance, we need another engine, and we have done that for years as well. That doesn't really get caught up in the mutual aid MABUS type of flavor because it's just a one-off. Okay. The one-offs, unfortunately, occur essentially every week. For instance, it occurred Friday night, it occurred Sunday morning. So those one-offs, because of the fact that the calls are happening more frequently and they're overlapping, unlike other disciplines, we can't wait until, somebody clears the hospital to go to the next call. So, we have an obligation to respond, in some level of immediacy. And we do work with our partners, partners from the south across the border. Our departments in Illinois, Winter Harbor, Zion, Beach Park, Newport. We operate as if the state line is not there. Unfortunately, we can't go east. We utilize City of Kenosha often, as they have, more resources than some of the other agencies. Bristol, as an example, we utilize them. However, if you look at just the geographics, they're coming from, 45 and Highway C. So it's taking them at least 15 minutes to get out the door. And we've trained our people to anticipate some of those things. So if we hear something that might need extra resources, we're looking to do that on the front end. So we're in every effort to minimize time, because that's one of the things we're always fighting is the clock.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. And since you're up here, Chief, so how much time does it buy us with this possible referendum going through? Like, how many years would that increase in staffing cover us to then get on pace with where you want to be, and then we would naturally add from there?
Great question. I'd hate to
I know it can't be perfect, but I mean,
speculate, but I would think, give us another 8 to 9 years.
Okay.
Based on you look at call volume and look at, if I just, again, I'm speculating, but if you look at, how we've seen our call volumes, call 1, call 2, then call 3.
Right.
Well, we can't handle call 3, and by the time call 4 comes to, into the picture, unit 1 or the people from call 1 are cleared, and now they can attend to that call.
Right. Okay. That's what I was hoping.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
So, we've come to, in my opinion, we've come to that part in our life as a village that we just don't have that, I'll say, that third resource.
Right. Okay. Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
And then Nathan, wanted to thank you for all the work you put into the other options for the community. I think that helps that we're trying to find ways to do this. And then you, like you said, put it out to kind of public consensus on where things are at. And I think that'll help.
Yeah, and just for clarity, I mean, we really are wanting to engage the community and get their input. I mean, from a staff standpoint, for us, what might be an obvious answer is not always obvious, right? And I think that it's fair to hopefully, as the community learns and understands the situation, they'll feel they'll be able to offer, a recommendation, and our recommendation, their recommendation, the board's recommendation will all align, because ultimately it is the services are for the community, right? So one thing I do want to point out, and Dave, I don't know if you mind coming up, but one other point that we didn't necessarily highlight, and I know that we've belabored the discussion a little bit, but I think it's important to recognize what will be the impact from the police side of things too. And can you just talk a little bit, just to the third shift thought
Sure.
process?
It's not unusual, and we went through a recent restructuring as well. It's not unusual to have 3 officers assigned to third shift on any given evening, whether it's a weekday or a weeknight. And those 3 officers have to cover those 33 square miles. Now we informally help each other out, whether it's Kenosha PD asking us for assistance or vice versa, or getting some help from the county. But on those nights where we have 3 officers, and I'll use third shift as an example, on any critical call where an officer needs backup, say an intoxicated driver, which happens basically 150, 160 times a year. A lot of those happen on third shift. That's 2 officers out of the mix for at least an hour. That leaves us 1 officer to maintain security and control and patrol and answering calls for service in a village of 21,000 people and 33 square miles. I wish I could do something else with staffing. But if you take away from Detective Bureau, now you're taking away from those resources that follow up on those crimes and make sure that the victims are contacted and the cases reach court and all the leads are followed so we can have successful prosecution. We can assist the prosecutor with those successful prosecutions. So that's the most impactful. Now I could fill those spots with overtime, and I know some people think that way, but now you're starting to burn out those officers who are working those 12-hour shifts, who are working from 3 in the afternoon till 3 in the morning to cover that. And you can do that for a little period of time. We did it during the civil unrest. We did it during part of the pandemic. And we put those plans together for situations specifically like that. But for the day-to-day operations, we are hoping to add more to that patrol level to substantially improve the services we can provide there.
Thank you. I think hopefully that helped to just illustrate again, provide a little bit of flavor with regard to, you know, the square mileage that we have to cover, the population that we need to cover, and in order to provide adequate service to the village. That I think there's a level of expectation that, and I think we perform very well, and we want to continue to perform to our highest and best. So thank you for your time tonight.